I've never felt rage hit me that fast. Karen marched into my friend's garage spinning lies, calling the cops like she owned the street. But then the agent leaned close, smirking, and whispered the line that froze her cold. "Wait. He trains the FBI. Let me take you back." I was flipping burgers on the ranch grill when the first HOA email pinged, sudden, formal, and ominous. The mesquite smoke curled lazily over the fence line, filling the morning air with its earthy sweetness. Sunlight hit the dust motes floating above the pasture, and for a moment everything felt ordinary calm. My hand paused mid-turn spatula, hovering as I reached for my phone. The subject line alone made me glance up at the neighbors' fences, imagining Karen's sharp eyes peeking over the top boards, the ones she had obsessively painted last summer. I wiped my hands on a well-worn apron and squinted at the glowing screen. "Violation, notice," it read in bold, underlined text. My stomach twisted. It was just a small thing, someone had left a garden ornament visible from the street, but the tone of the message felt like a gavel dropping. I leaned back against the grill, trying to let the scent of mesquite soothe my nerves, but there was a prickling at the back of my neck that refused to fade. Across the driveway, I could see old Mrs. Harlan peeking over her porch railing. She gave a quick nod and whispered to the neighbor beside her, "Watch Karen." The words barely reached my ears over the sizzle of the burgers, but the warning landed like a stone in my gut. I had known Karen from a distance for years enough to recognize that glint in her eyes, the kind that suggested she took pleasure in others' discomfort. I lifted the pocket watch from my apron pocket, its brass case worn from decades of handling. The ticking was steady, grounding me amidst the fluttering worry the email had sparked. My father had carried this watch around the family ranch for years before me, and it felt like a small anchor, a reminder that some things endured despite the noise of others. The day had started like any other. I had dragged the coals into place while the dog trotted around the pasture, kicking up small clouds of dust. The cows shifted in the distance, lowing softly in the heat of the morning sun. The neighbors' children raced past the fence, laughing, their voices light and carefree. It was almost cruel how ordinary this morning felt, considering the sense of unease that had begun to settle in my chest. I clicked open the email, my thumb brushing over the screen. It detailed the first minor complaint, a request to remove a bird feeder that supposedly violated a neighborhood regulation. The words were polite enough barely, but there was an unmistakable edge, an undercurrent of authority and scrutiny that made the skin on my arms prickle. Even reading the lines aloud to myself sounded like an accusation. I felt my grip tighten on the spatula. A sudden breeze rustled the papers stacked near the grill, receipts from feed orders, bills, and a dog license. One sheet lifted and curled at the edges as if mimicking the uncertainty that now hovered over my routine. I bent to flatten it, and for a moment I noticed the way the sun hit the edges of the fence posts, casting long, slender shadows across the yard. The simple geometry was oddly comforting, a reminder that not everything could be contorted by petty rules. The neighbor ambled over, squinting at the screen in my hands. "That's how it starts," he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of sympathy and warning. "First it's small, then it grows." Karen loves to keep score. I nodded, though I felt the heat in my chest rising. He patted the dog on the head, and the animal barked once sharply, as if sensing the tension I was trying to swallow down. I returned my attention to the grill, letting the spatula hover above the burger. Smoke curled up, carrying the scent of mesquite and sizzling meat. The pocket watch ticked steadily, grounding me again. For a moment I imagined the weeks ahead, quiet mornings disrupted by letters, phone calls, perhaps visits from HOA representatives. My stomach clenched at the thought, but somewhere beneath the anxiety a stubborn resolve began to flicker. This was my ranch, my life, and I wasn't about to let someone else dictate the rhythm of it. The dog barked again, chasing a dust mote, or perhaps just echoing my own restless energy. I could hear the neighbor retreating back to his porch, muttering under his breath about HOA politics and Karen's obsession with perfection. I adjusted the burgers on the grill, letting the spatula scrape against the metal with a satisfying rasp. And then I froze. My eyes were fixed on the phone screen, the cursor blinking patiently as if daring me to respond. The calm ranch days, the ones measured by the sun moving across the pasture, the scent of smoke, the sound of a distant dog were under threat. My fingers tightened on the tongs, and for the first time that morning I felt that all-too-familiar surge, a mix of frustration, cautious anger, and the spark of determination. I inhaled deeply. The aroma of mesquite filled my lungs, carrying with it a sense of the ordinary life I cherished. The paper in my hand crinkled as I let it fall back to the stack. I knew this was only the beginning. One email, one subtle intrusion, and suddenly the familiar world had shifted just enough to make me wonder how long the peace would last. I glanced once more at the glowing screen, the words "Violation Notice" staring back at me impassive, yet insistent. I held the spatula mid-air, the burgers sizzling beneath it, and let myself imagine the days to come. They would be difficult, no doubt. But I had the watch in my pocket that passed beneath my feet, and enough stubbornness in my bones to meet whatever came next. For now, I would flip the burgers, inhale the smoky air, and wait. The sun climbed higher, brightening the fences and the dust-laden drive, but the shadow of that first HOA email stretched long in my mind. And just as I thought I might let it go, the faintest shiver ran up my spine, whispering that Karen's eyes were watching even if I couldn't see them. The email arrived just as I was closing up the office windows, the warm summer evening settling over the ranch like a slow sigh. The scent of faint coffee from my mug lingered on the desk, mingling with the dusty tang of sun-baked wood. I opened the thread and immediately froze. Karen had fired off another message, this time public sent to the entire HOA board. Her words cut sharper than the first email, though the violation itself was minor. My landscaping, she wrote, failed to meet the aesthetic standards expected of the neighborhood, citing a patch of wildflowers along the edge of the driveway. I set my coffee down and reread it, brow furrowed. Wildflowers, really. The kind that bloom freely, a touch of color against the monotony of beige and brown desert. My hands trembled slightly as I scrolled through the thread, taking in her meticulous catalog of supposed infractions. Each bullet point dripped with an air of superiority and self-righteousness, as if she were delivering judgment from some elevated perch. The neighbors had begun to gather on their porches, exchanging hushed whispers that drifted faintly across the dusty drive. I could hear the rustle of someone shifting on a metal chair, the faint clink of ice in a glass. "She's not stopping?" one neighbor murmured to another, eyes flicking toward my office window. I pressed the corner of the deed to my chest, the worn leather binding rubbing against my thumb. It had been years since I last examined it, but now it felt heavier in my hands, a reminder that there were rules beyond Karen's whims. I remembered Tom's recent work on the garage, how he'd reinforced the doors and installed a small security camera at my suggestion. Nothing about it violated any codes I knew, but Karen had a habit of twisting the mundane into scandal. My mind ticked over the possibilities. Could she seize on the garage as the next target? I made a mental note to review the easement and water rights again, just to see if any technicalities might offer protection. The deed lay open on the desk, a small victory hiding in plain sight. I noticed a clause referencing water rights along the northern edge of the property, a detail that Karen and the HOA seemed blissfully unaware of. My fingers traced the embossed text, shaking slightly with excitement. If challenged, I realized this would give me leverage, a foothold against what was clearly an overreach. The sun dipped lower, casting the office in a golden haze that made the dust in the air visible, tiny motes suspended like a promise of calm that hadn't yet arrived. Karen's exaggeration wasn't just annoying, it was strategic. I could feel it in the way she framed every complaint, the subtle suggestion that, if left unchecked, my property could become an eyesore by her standards. My eyes scanned the thread again, noting how her tone shifted from formal to insistent, with each paragraph her sentences punctuated by polite threats masquerading as guidance. Each word weighed on me, but I forced a slow breath, letting the aroma of the coffee and the evening's warmth anchor me. I drafted a quick reply to the HOA, keeping it factual, pointed, and careful. I referenced the specific covenant she had misquoted and attached a scan of the deed highlighting the water rights clause. My hand hovered over the send button for a moment longer than necessary. There was satisfaction in laying out the facts, in knowing I had evidence to counteract her barrage, but also a lingering worry this was only the first volley. In the quiet that followed, I leaned back in the chair and watched the shadows stretch across the property. The wind stirred a few loose papers on my desk, the rustling a subtle reminder that life carried on, despite the email ping. The smell of coffee lingered, grounding me as I considered the neighbors' reactions. A few glanced over, nodding slightly as if recognizing the momentary victory in my eyes. They didn't speak, but the shared understanding was palpable. Karen's power was formidable, yet not absolute. The micro-climax came as I realized that this technicality buried in legalese and small print gave me hope. I wasn't defenseless. The HOA's authority had limits, and the law, dry, cumbersome, and precise, could be wielded like a shield. My pulse quickened, and for the first time since the initial email, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least I had footing. I stacked the papers neatly, careful not to crumple the corner of the deed. The burgers from last summer's cookout lingered faintly in memory, a reminder of a simpler time when the only decisions were seasoning and heat. I sipped the coffee, letting the warmth seep into my chest, and imagined what might come next. There would be more complaints, more scrutiny, more subtle jabs aimed at unsettling the routine life I cherished. But armed with evidence and a little stubbornness, I felt the first stirrings of confidence. And then, just as the evening shadows deepened, the ping came again. A new email from Karen appeared in the inbox. The subject line alone hinted at escalation regarding the garage improvements. My fingers froze over the keyboard, the coffee cup halfway to my lips. She was preparing the second wave. The office felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in, yet the sunset filtered through the blinds with a forgiving warmth. The pocket watch in my apron pocket ticked faintly, reminding me of the past of continuity and of endurance. I straightened, inhaling the faint aroma of coffee and mesquite lingering from the distant barbecue pit. My heart steadied. The battle was just beginning, but at least now I knew the rules, and I knew where to hold the line. The diner smelled like hot grease and strong coffee, the kind that left a bitter edge on the tongue no matter how much cream you stirred in. The morning crowd was thinning, the clatter of forks and plates softening into a low hum. I sat in a booth near the window, the sun leaking through half-tilted blinds, when Martin Caldwell slid across from me. His arrival was never subtle. He bumped the table with his hip, nearly upending the napkin dispenser, and spilled a little of his coffee as he set the mug down. He smirked like he'd meant to do it. "You look like a man reading a death sentence," he said, eyes flicking to the stack of papers I'd laid out between the salt shaker and ketchup bottle. "Feels like one," I muttered, pushing the HOA bylaws across the formica. He leaned in the faint smell of aftershave clinging to him and thumbed through the documents with a practiced ease. Martin had been my mentor years ago, back when I worked as an auditor. He had the kind of mind that saw cracks in granite weak spots no one else noticed. Retired now, he spent more time fishing than in boardrooms, but his instincts hadn't dulled. "Karen's got a taste for control," he said, flipping a page. "She's quoting sections half right, hoping no one checks. Classic overreach." The waitress passed by, refilling mugs with a quiet efficiency. She gave me a glance, half sympathy, half curiosity, before disappearing toward the kitchen. I shifted in my seat, the vinyl creaking, and pulled a folder from my bag. Inside were photos the garage Tom had reinforced the water lines running along the edge of my property, and a few shots of Karen's pristine front yard, immaculate to the point of obsession. Martin whistled low, tapping one of the photos. "She'll come after this next. The garage. Too visible. Easy target." I nodded, already aware. My hand drifted to my pocket, where I carried a small engraved ranch key gift from my father when I first bought the place. I laid it gently on the table, its surface catching a beam of sunlight. It wasn't just a key. It was a reminder of ownership, of legacy, of something beyond HOA checklists. Martin noticed, his smirk softening. "Hold on to that. Sometimes a symbol keeps you steady when the paper war tries to drown you." We went over the deed line by line. He pointed out language the board likely hadn't read, carefully, loopholes buried in the covenants. I scribbled notes on a yellow pad, the pen scratching against the paper in rhythm with the clinking dishes behind us. The plan was forming, quiet, methodical. "You'll need more than documents," Martin said, lowering his voice. "Photos. Neighbors willing to vouch. Anything that paints a picture bigger than her narrative. Build it like an audit. You know how." I sipped the coffee, bitter and hot, and let the words settle. He was right. It wasn't enough to play defense. I'd need to shape the story before Karen cemented hers. I thought of Tom, steady and loyal, who had helped with the garage. Maybe he'd be willing to sign a statement. The Wilsons down the road had already muttered about Karen's heavy-handedness. Perhaps their testimony could add weight. Martin tapped the bylaws again, his finger landing on a section about reasonable use of property. He arched a brow. "That phrase, 'what's reasonable?' That's your lever. Make them define it. Force their hand." The waitress returned with a plate of eggs and toast for Martin. He dug in without ceremony, talking between bites. "You need to stay calm. Make it about the facts. Let her temper do the work for you. Folks like Karen burn hot and fast. All you need is to stand steady. The quiet hero plan," he called it. Not a frontal assault, but a slow turning of the tide. Collect evidence, highlight contradictions, keep the board honest by showing what they'd rather ignore. Influence quietly through precision, not noise. I looked at the stack of documents, the photos, the notes. For the first time in months, the path forward felt less like stumbling in the dark and more like a map unfolding. My chest tightened, not with dread, but with a flicker of resolve. The diner's hum faded into the background as Martin leaned back, wiping his hands on a napkin. "See, you're not as trapped as you thought. There's always a way to flip the script." The words settled deep. I felt it, the feasibility of it all. This wasn't just survival. There was a chance to stand tall to expose Karen's tactics for what they were. The pocket watch in my apron back home ticked on marking time, but the key on the table gleamed brighter, a reminder of control not yet surrendered. The micro-climax landed as a quiet conviction the fight wasn't hopeless. With evidence with strategy, I could push back. Martin caught my expression and chuckled softly. He sipped his coffee, then leaned forward one last time. His voice was low, steady, the way he spoke when he wanted me to remember something years later. "Don't get comfortable, Garrett. She won't back down quietly. The more cornered she feels, the louder and dirtier she'll get." His words hung between us as the diner door chimed and a warm gust of desert air swept in. I gathered my papers, sliding the key back into my pocket. The clink of Martin's cup against the saucer echoed faintly like a warning bell. I walked out into the Tucson sun with the taste of bitter coffee still on my tongue, the plan brewing in my mind, and the certainty that the real storm was only beginning. The cursor blinked at the bottom of my drafted email like a pulse. I'd rewritten the closing paragraph twice, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, the faint scent of cut grass drifting through the open window. The late afternoon sun poured into the ranch office, slanting shadows across the deed I'd spread out for courage. Finally, I exhaled and hit send. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. My hand trembled slightly as I withdrew it from the mouse, almost embarrassed by the surge of adrenaline. It wasn't just an email. It was my first formal response to the HOA, carefully worded, anchored in legal phrasing Martin had coached me through. The silence that followed was heavy. I poured myself a glass of water, watching the condensation bead down the sides before daring to refresh my inbox. Her reply came faster than I expected. Karen's name in bold letters, subject line screaming, "Community Standards Reminder." I opened it, the text cold and clipped. She accused me of setting a poor example of undermining neighborhood cohesion, all under the guise of reminding everyone about landscaping rules. The words weren't aimed at me privately this time. She'd copied the entire HOA mailing list. I leaned back, the chair creaking. Outside, the neighbor's lawnmower hummed a sharp contrast to the words that now burned across my screen. My phone buzzed a neighbor, forwarding the email with nothing but 3 dots and a question mark. Another text came in softer, "Hang in there." Some of us see through this. I held the phone, absorbing the duality, whispers of support, whispers of doubt. My reply had drawn the battle line out into the open. On the desk beside me lay the engraved ranch key, warm from the sun. I picked it up, turning it between my fingers, the notches familiar against my skin. But when I tightened my grip, a faint hairline crack along the shaft caught the light. I froze, angling it closer. A flaw, small, almost invisible, but there. The key had always been solid, enduring. Seeing it fractured sent a ripple through me, a symbol of steadiness now bearing its first wound. Martin's voice replayed in my head from the diner weeks before. She won't back down quietly. He'd warned me, and the crack felt like proof of the strain. The sound of typing filled the room again as another email arrived. This one wasn't from Karen directly, but from a board member, echoing her concerns in a more diplomatic tone. "We encourage all residents to maintain standards." The chorus was beginning. I pressed my palms against the desk, the wood grain firm under my skin. For a moment, doubt pressed heavier than resolve. Was I making things worse? My small pushback had drawn out not just Karen's scorn, but the complicity of others. Then another ping, different this time. A neighbor wrote privately, "I admire that you spoke up. We've felt the same pressure for years." I breathed out slowly, the air dry in my throat. This was the midpoint, I realized. The calm before was gone. The line between me and Karen had thickened, no longer private skirmish, but community stage. The fight wasn't just about grass height or a garage wall anymore. It was about narrative, about who defined the rules we all lived under. I looked down again at the cracked key, its shine dulled by the flaw. A metaphor, if there ever was one. My hands closed around it, firm but careful, as if too much pressure might break it entirely. The room seemed quieter now, punctuated only by the faint clicking of sprinklers outside and the distant laughter of kids on bikes. The everyday world rolled on, but inside the tension coiled tighter. I typed a short note to Martin summarizing the latest volley, attaching the HOA email chain. No long explanations, just facts. He'd know what to make of them. I hit send and sat back the office chair, groaning under my weight. The micro-climax came in the realization that the stakes weren't simply personal anymore. The dialogue had opened, neighbors were watching, choosing sides, speaking in whispers that carried more weight than the bylaws themselves. My stand had set something in motion larger than I'd intended. I placed the cracked key back on the deed, its imperfection resting squarely on the words that defined ownership. My gaze lingered, unease and resolve mingling. The sun dipped lower, painting the ranch office in amber. I leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, staring at the key until the line of the crack blurred into shadow. Karen's next move was coming. I could feel it. And this time, I wasn't the only one who'd be watching. The hearing room hummed like a beehive before the swarm. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum, voices overlapped in restless waves, and the faint smell of burnt coffee and paper filled the air. I gripped my folder tighter, feeling the sweat collecting along my wrist despite the cool blast of the air conditioner. Karen sat across from me, a stack of binders at her side, lips curved in that familiar smirk. Her eyes locked onto mine the moment I stepped in a silent dare. She thrived in these rooms. Authority, procedure, and performance were her weapons. I took my seat at the long table, setting down the leather folder with a deliberate thud. Inside, the deed and water rights glimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights, the sheen of old ink on sturdy paper. I ran a finger along the embossed seal, grounding myself in its weight. The HOA board shuffled their notes, voices droning as they recited procedural language. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. I wasn't here to spar with words, I was here to anchor them to facts. The microphone clicked on with a hollow pop. I leaned forward. My family's ranch has stood outside these regulations for decades, I began, voice steady, though my chest tightened. The deed predates your covenants. The water rights are recorded under state law, not HOA bylaw. I placed the documents flat before the board, their edges crisp, undeniable. Karen shot up almost immediately, flipping open her binder with a theatrical rustle. With all due respect, Mr. Reynolds, she said, venom tucked behind her veneer of civility, you're undermining the very cohesion that keeps this community safe. These documents don't exempt you from standards everyone else honors. Murmurs rippled through the room. I caught Tom's eye in the back row. He gave a small nod, jaw set, and just beside him I noticed someone else half hidden, leaning toward a neighbor. The man wore a neat blazer, his voice low but clear enough for me to catch. Wait, he trains the FBI. The words snagged in the air. My focus sharpened. I hadn't planned for that part of my past to surface, but once whispered, it threaded through the room like wildfire. Neighbors shifted in their seats, recalibrating. Karen noticed too. For the first time, a flicker of unease shadowed her smirk. She tried to mask it with another barrage of citations rattling off HOA bylaws like ammunition, but her rhythm faltered just enough. I didn't rise to her bait. Instead, I kept my eyes on the board, fingers steadying the documents. This isn't about appearances, I said quietly into the mic, the click punctuating each syllable. It's about rights. Rights recognized by the state of Arizona, rights you cannot overrule with procedural threats. The board hesitated. Pages stopped flipping. One of them adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to the deed as though it carried more gravity than Karen's words. The tension thickened. I could feel the weight of every gaze, every whispered exchange in the rows behind me. My pulse drummed at my temples, but my hands no longer shook. And then, almost as if sensing her grip slipping, Karen leaned forward, her voice rising. If we allow this, she gestured broadly toward me, we erode the very structure that keeps us united. What message does that send, that one man can rewrite the rules? Silence followed, a silence heavy enough to bend the air. The micro-climax hit in that stillness. The board wavered. They weren't convinced yet, but they weren't following Karen blindly anymore, and she knew it. Her eyes narrowed, lips tightening. She glanced at the ally seated beside her, whispering something too low for me to hear. But her smirk returned sharper, almost triumphant, as though she had a hidden card waiting. The crack in prop number 2 pressed against my thigh through my pocket. I reached down, brushing the cool metal of the ranch key with my fingertips, almost afraid it might break entirely if I clutched it harder. I sat back, shoulders straightening, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The board's deliberation had only begun, but the battle line was drawn clearer than ever. Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The golden light of early evening stretched long across the patio, painting the mesquite beams in warm hues. Folding chairs lined the stone courtyard of my ranch, their arrangement neat but simple. No grand hall, no polished dais, just neighbors gathered under open sky. The scent of dust and faint barbecue smoke lingered in the air, carried by a breeze that rustled the cottonwoods along the wash. I stood at the edge of the crowd, papers tucked under my arm. Tonight wasn't about speeches or grandstanding. Tonight was about letting the evidence speak for itself. The HOA board had arrived earlier, shuffling in with guarded expressions. They now sat facing the community, hands folded on their laps as if bracing against the inevitable. Karen perched near the front row, back straight, chin tilted. Her smirk had dulled over the months, but she clung to it like armor. Martin stood just behind me, arms folded, the faintest smirk tugging at his weathered face. He gave a small nod, a silent reminder. Steady, Garrett. I exhaled, stepped forward, and placed the deed onto the wooden podium we'd borrowed from the community center. Its parchment edges caught the light, the embossed seal gleaming like a coin. I laid down the easement documents, followed by the compliance letters we had painstakingly compiled. The board chair cleared his throat, his voice steady but low. This evening we acknowledge review of the deed and associated documents. It is the determination of this board that Mr. Reynolds' property lies outside the scope of HOA enforcement. Rights to water and land access are hereby recognized. A hush rippled across the courtyard, as though even the cicadas paused. Then the first pair of hands clapped. Others followed, building into a wave of applause that echoed against the adobe walls. I let the sound wash over me, not as triumph, but as release. For years, the tension had gnawed at me, the constant emails, the whispered doubts, the crack of my own faith. Now the community saw the truth plain and public. From my pocket, I drew out the pocket watch. Prop number 3. The silver had dulled with age. Its hinge once weakened, but tonight it gleamed in the light as if newly forged. I clicked it open, and the face was smooth, the crack that had run across its glass now nearly invisible, repaired with care. I set it gently atop the deed, the tick faint but steady. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Neighbors leaned closer, murmuring. The watch had belonged to my father, its rhythm tied to long nights of ranch labor, to family gatherings, to resilience. To see it restored whole again felt like a covenant renewed. Martin's eyes softened, pride hidden behind his gruff exterior. He didn't need to say a word. Karen, though, stiffened. Her arms crossed tightly, nails digging into her sleeves. For the first time she had no binder, no citation, no cutting remark. Her eyes darted across the faces around her, searching for an ally, but found none. The applause had shifted the air. Influence once hers had drained out like sand through a sieve. The microclimax arrived not in shouting, but in silence. She knew it. Her defeat wasn't legal alone, it was communal. The neighbors she had once rallied with fear now clapped freely, their smiles open, their shoulders unburdened. I stood still, watch ticking beside the deed, letting the breeze turn a corner of the parchment. My victory wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. When the applause subsided, I gathered the papers, sliding them back into their folder. I caught Karen's gaze for the briefest second. Her smirk faltered. A flicker of something raw crossed her eyes, anger maybe, or disbelief. She turned away, lips pressed thin. I didn't chase her downfall with gloating. Quiet dignity was enough. As the crowd lingered, neighbors approached, some with handshakes, others with quiet apologies for doubting. Children darted between chairs, chasing each other in the golden light, laughter spilling where tension once sat. Martin leaned closer, his voice low. Well done. But don't think she's done. Folks like Karen, they always look for loose threads. I nodded. The cliffhanger tugged at the edge of my relief. Tonight was victory, yes, but not an ending. Karen's kind rarely surrendered quietly. I closed the watch, slipping it back into my pocket, its weight grounding me. Above the last of the sun dipped, leaving the sky brushed in lavender and copper. The applause still echoed faintly in my ears, but so did Martin's warning. And I knew quiet planning would be needed still. The ranch office was quieter than I had expected. Afternoon light slanted through the blinds, casting thin bars across the desk where stacks of papers waited for one final review. Outside, I could hear the low hum of a tractor somewhere down the wash, steady and distant, like a reminder that life went on after storms. Martin sat across from me, glasses perched low on his nose, thumbing through a folder with deliberate care. His old leather briefcase rested at his feet, worn but dependable, much like the man himself. Between us sat a cooling mug of coffee, the surface reflecting a pale square of sunlight. "Not bad," he muttered, tapping the edge of a compliance form. "Your filings are cleaner than most attorneys I've seen." I chuckled, though my hands still hovered uncertainly over the stack. Cleaner, maybe, but they need to be airtight. Karen's the type to sniff out any comma out of place. Martin looked up, a dry smile tugging at his mouth. "That's why we're checking twice." I spread out the final packet deed copies, easement confirmation, the board's acknowledgement from the ceremony, and my own response letters. The room smelled faintly of ink and paper dust overlaid with the sharp aroma of coffee. The sound of turning pages was louder than it should have been, each shuffle punctuating the quiet. At the corner of the desk rested the pocket watch prop number 3. I'd left it open, ticking steadily, its restored face catching every glint of sun. Tonight, I'd move it to the display case on the shelf above my desk, not hidden in a drawer anymore. Symbolism mattered, and this watch deserved to be visible, its rhythm steady over the ranch office that had seen years of strain. Neighbors had stopped by earlier, dropping off peach cobbler and handwritten notes, quiet gestures that meant more than they likely realized. One couple offered to help repair the north fence. Another left a small envelope with money toward legal costs. None of them said much, but their presence filled the room even after they left, like warmth stored in the adobe walls. Martin cleared his throat, pulling me back to the table. "Here," he said, pointing to a margin. "Clerk missed a date reference. Better to correct it now." I leaned in, pen in hand, the ink flowing smooth across the paper as I adjusted the line. The correction was small, almost invisible, but the act itself felt decisive. Every mark reinforced not just legality, but authority. When the last correction was made, Martin closed the file with a firm slap of his palm. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose, satisfied. "That'll hold." I sealed the packet with careful fingers, pressing the flap shut as though I were sealing more than envelopes, sealing the years of anxiety, the questions, the late-night rereads of bylaws under dim light. This time, there would be no cracks left for Karen to exploit. A sense of quiet confidence settled over me, heavier than relief, but lighter than pride. For the first time in years, the balance tipped toward stability. Martin rose, stretching stiff joints, and gave a subtle nod. "You've done well. Now the key is making sure this sticks. Lasting protection. Think about the systems, not just the skirmishes." His words hung in the room long after he left. I sat back, gaze shifting to the pocket watch on the desk. Its ticking blended with the faint tractor hum outside, both steady, both reassuring. The watch wasn't just mended. It was where it belonged, visible, steady, a reminder of resilience passed down and reinforced. Neighbors' laughter drifted faintly from across the pasture, and for a moment the ranch felt whole again. Still, my mind turned restless. The battle had been won. Yes, but what about the years ahead? How do you keep a victory from unraveling once the crowd goes home? The cliffhanger wasn't in Karen's next move, it was in mine. I tapped the sealed packet with my finger, thinking of bylaws, reform community votes, maybe even a charter amendment. Quiet protection. Long term. The sun slid lower, filling the room with a bronze glow. I reached for the watch, closed its lid with a gentle click, and placed it carefully in the display case above the desk. Its ticking still filled the room, but now from a place of honor. Loose ends remained, but for the first time I felt ready to tie them. The mesquite smoke curled lazily above the backyard, drifting into the orange sky as the sun sank behind the ridge. My old grill hissed and sputtered, loaded with ribs and burgers the same way it had on that morning years ago when the first HOA email arrived. Only tonight, laughter carried across the lawn instead of suspicion, and the glow in the neighbors' eyes wasn't wary. It was grateful. The long tables had been dragged out beneath the cottonwoods covered in checkered cloth. Kids darted between chairs, chasing one another with sparklers while their parents leaned back, plates full and spirits light. Martin stood near the end of the table, cup in hand, smirking at me the way he always had, half proud, half amused. On the porch rail behind me, the pocket watch rested in its glass case. Its steady tick was faint but unmistakable, catching the lantern light each time someone passed. Prop number 3 had found its final home, not tucked away, not cracked, but whole and visible. It watched over the gathering like a quiet guardian, much as my family had once done for me. "Not a bad turnout," Martin said as he ambled over, nodding toward the tables. I flipped a rack of ribs, the juice sizzling. "Not bad at all. Feels different this time." Different was the right word. HOA rules had been revised, signed off, and posted on the board's website. No more arbitrary fines over grass height or phantom violations. A clause now guaranteed transparent hearings, and any special assessment required a majority vote from homeowners, not the whim of one domineering personality. The board clerk had even asked me to help draft a checklist for compliance, a small irony I didn't miss. But tonight wasn't about paperwork. Near the shed, we'd hung framed photos of the ranch through the years the garage Tom built the cracked key before it was mended, the deed freshly notarized after the hearing. Neighbors drifted past the makeshift gallery, pointing and recalling their own stories, fences repaired, birthdays hosted, seasons endured together. One corner held a small box labeled Community Fund. I'd pitched the idea to seed scholarships for local kids and tools for shared projects. To my surprise, it filled faster than the plates on the buffet table. Karen was nowhere in sight. Word had spread she'd stepped down from her HOA post after the reforms. Some neighbors mentioned she'd sold her place and moved closer to her sister in Phoenix. Others shrugged uninterested. Her absence hung less like victory and more like release, a final untangling of a knot that had bound us too long. I wandered away from the grill for a moment, following the path toward the back fence. The ground crunched softly under my boots, the night air cooler now. From here, the whole scene stretched before me, the tables lit with string bulb smoke rising in gentle plumes, laughter rolling steady as the desert breeze. For years, I'd thought of justice as a battle won in a hearing room or a paper filed in the right place at the right time. Tonight proved otherwise. Justice had taken root here in the form of shared food, children's laughter, and the quiet relief on the faces of neighbors who no longer feared a knock on the door over petty rules. The pocket watch ticked faintly behind me, steady and sure. I imagined my father's hands setting it down at the end of his workday, never knowing it would one day symbolize an entire community's endurance. Martin joined me by the fence, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "So," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, "you think it'll hold this time?" I let the silence stretch before answering, the wind brushing against my sleeves. "It will. Not because of me. Because of them." I nodded toward the neighbors, their voices weaving together like a quilt. We stood there a while longer, neither of us speaking. The stars were beginning to show faint pinpricks against the vast Arizona sky. Somewhere down the wash, the tractor had stopped, replaced by the distant yip of coyotes. When I finally returned to the tables, I raised a glass. The conversation's dimmed faces turning toward me, expectant but easy. I wasn't a man of speeches, never had been, so I kept it simple. "We've all been through plenty," I said, the words carried by the hush. "And somehow, we're here tonight, not just with better rules, but with better trust. That's worth more than any bylaw." The cheer that rose was warm, but not wild, genuine as the glow of the lanterns. Plates clinked, chairs scraped, music started up from someone's speaker. I sat back down, ribs cooling on my plate, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle deep in my chest. Justice had balanced. Fairness had found its place. And as the watch ticked in the background, I knew the ranch and the people bound to it would carry forward steadier than before. The clerk's stamp echoed soft in the hall, and with it the ledger finally closed. On the wall behind us, the old pocket watch, once cracked, now whole, rested in its glass case, ticking like a witness. Justice, I've learned, doesn't shout. It files, it seals, it endures. We refunded the fees, struck out the bad citations, and reopened the paths we should never have lost. If you've ever faced an HOA letter with your name spelled wrong, remember, paper cuts can heal when neighbors stand steady. What's the most unexpected way you've seen fairness restored?